So I was asked to do the advanced session on ecological economics. I'm not quite sure what that means. So, but because it's a very vast field, so it's sort of hard to decide. You might have other views on it because you might also have been thinking and studying about this kind of topic. So what I did is I just chose like 2 or 3 areas that I think are really cool and interesting to think about. They're not necessarily my areas, and we'll get going with that, and hopefully have a discussion. And in the discussion, you're of course very welcome to bring in your own interests and concerns, whether they're on topics or concepts or models or whatever it is related to it, or in terms of careers or activism or anything else that you think is relevant. So off we go. And I think I'll be talking probably for too long, but about probably 40 minutes in terms of just like doing the presentation bit. And then we'll have a lot of time in the rest of the afternoon just for discussion and for coffee breaks and other kinds of breaks. So I hope it will be comfortable and interesting. Okay, so why did I want to talk about beyond green growth? That's the first thing I want to cover. Then I'll talk about recent advances and frontiers, and within that I'll also talk about what work remains to be done and how to combine academia and effective activism. So hopefully that will as sort of the main things I wanted to cover. So I think the first thing is to justify going beyond green growth. So the joke of this title is that Herman Daly, who's one of the fathers, I'm afraid even ecological economics has more fathers than mothers. This is all very sad. But it does have some mothers, which is great. So why beyond green growth? So Herman Daly, who's one of the fathers of ecological economics, wrote this very famous book, Beyond Growth, which I still recommend that you have a look at if you haven't read it already. But so that was one of the foundational texts. He was chief economist of the World Bank, and they kicked him out because of his ideas. So now I'd like us not to have to talk about green growth anymore. So the original mission of ecological economics was basically, in my view, twofold. So I'm just going to do a bit of catch up, and just so that we're comfortable with where we are in the discussion. So the first goal of ecological economics was to bring the topic of the environmental scale of economic activities into the heart of economics, and not to, so both in terms of theory, of modeling, and of policy guidance. So really going much further than mainstream or environmental economics, much further than externalities or costing, basically. So really posing the question of environmental scale as a foundational challenge, on the scale of like Copernicus challenging the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. To really challenge the foundations of economics and to transform it as a whole topic. That was the first ambition. It is fair to say that we have so far failed, because mainstream economics still stands for its own reasons. We can talk about that. The next thing is that was to study, model, and advocate for a just, so socially just economy within planetary boundaries. So the second point here is that the goal of this economy is to prioritize human well-being, safety, because crossing planetary boundaries is obviously very unsafe, and also human potential. So what could a human-centered economy look like? So basically a human-centered economy within environmental limits. If you know and have read Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, she formulates these ideas in a very nice and modern way that's very approachable. And so these ideas are becoming much more mainstream, partly through Kate Raworth's work. So I'm not going to talk about donut economics today, but this is certainly fits very, very well in the general idea. And if you want to bring that into the discussion, we can certainly do so. So at first, I would say, going back to this idea of green growth was an open research question. And it was an open research question for all kinds of reasons. So the idea of green growth is you have economic growth, which is the main core stated goals of our societies. We'll see if that's really the way things are. But if it's possible to have this continuing economic growth while bringing environmental impacts back within planetary boundaries, that's the first question. And ecological economics had to do a lot of work in order to study this, because one of the first things that people had to do was to deal with accounting for environmental interference in physical terms. And this was something that the field of economics did not like to do, because they like to account for things in monetary terms, in costs. But here we're talking about physical processes and bringing physical indicators into the economic system. And so there was a whole new topic of accounting and statistical methods that were needed to do society-wide material, energy, resource flow analysis, land use analysis, and so on. So we're not going to talk about that today, but just to remember that we're standing on, 3 decades of research in this topic that's still ongoing, but has really made huge progress. The academic field focused on this is called industrial ecology, and I would call it the sister field of ecological economics. And one of the topics you'll see it named as is social metabolism, the idea of how much resource use and how much waste societies use. So conceptually, we need to go beyond pollution and end-of-pipe frames, focusing on resource extraction and use. And this is something that's very obvious in ecological economics and industrial ecology. It is something that is completely non-obvious in the rest of the world. And I can give you just like 2 or 3 examples of that. So one is that this year I was looking for textbooks for an introductory environmental science class I was teaching, because I'm in a faculty of environment. Most ecological economists are not in economics faculties. That's one point to remember. So anyway, I'm teaching Introduction to Environmental Sciences. I'm looking for a textbook. All the textbooks I could find start with pollution. None of them start with resource use. So the view of environmental sciences, the mainstream environmental sciences, is still our problem stopped where the social boundary of resources ends. Like, we use resources, and it's when we stop using resources that we have an environmental impact. It's when we deliver them as waste and as pollution. But in fact, from an ecological economics and industrial ecology standpoint, the problem is at extraction and use. It's already when we demand resources from the environment that we have huge amounts of impacts, and that all our problems start. And if we want to resolve our problems, we better resolve them at the level of reducing extraction and use. We cannot physically reduce our impacts without reducing the throughput of resource use. Another example of why this thing, which is completely accepted in ecological economics and industrial ecology, is not in the rest of the world. So I've been involved in the latest round of the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in Working Group 3. But for instance, last August, the Working Group 1 colleagues had to argue with governments. They argued and lost the argument as to whether or not they would be able to name fossil fuels in the summary for policymakers. They were able to mention emissions, so they were able to mention the consequence, but not the cause. The cause is burning fossil fuels, using fossil fuels. They were not allowed to use the term fossil fuels in the summary for policymakers because the policymakers said, your job as physical scientists is only to deal with the emissions, again, an end-of-pipe approach, not to deal with the causes. The causes are in Working Group 3. In Working Group 3, we were in fact able to use the words fossil fuels in the summary for policymakers. But another example of that is even in Working Group 3, it's only in this version, the 6th assessment report, 30 years after the IPCC first started, that we were able to have a chapter on demand, to posing the question of why the heck do we use so much stuff? What is the purpose? Can we do things differently? 30 years to get a chapter questioning demand. So this thing, it sounds very basic to focus on resource extraction and use. It is not at all accepted in mainstream. So just to be clear on that. So this is, this question of green growth. So green growth is a favorite paradigm of mainstream economics. So, and I would describe it as a monoculture of ideas if you come across it. So it's preferred by status quo actors in policy, business, academia, and media. So effectively, alternative ideas and theories have been silenced by brown and growth interests. The critics of green growth are presented as marginal, pessimistic, unrealistic, anti-business, anti-development, anti-social, anti-human. So just a warning, if you decide that you want to start advocating for degrowth or post-growth positions, you get called really nasty things. Yesterday, in front of an auditorium of 500 people, I got called a spoiled child. I've been compared to Stalin and have had colleagues who've been called baby killers. Okay? Because it's really, yes?
Where was that? Where was
it was at Alternativa in Geneva. They invited the head of the Geneva Chamber of Commerce, and he didn't like the fact that I said that Geneva, as a hotbed of international oil trading, that sector needed to be shut down. So I'm a spoiled child. Anyway, informed democratic debate is prevented because when you get called names, your jaw drops onto the floor. You start looking around for it, picking it up, and I basically, anyway, whatever. So it's just to say that this is a very highly contentious domain. My view of it is certainly, we'll get back to this slide if we want to. I don't want to go into detail. So can we observe material decoupling? And this is something that I just wanted to go over this because even though it's quite basic, because it comes up so often. So just so we're all on the same page. So can we observe material decoupling? This idea that we can have, GDP growth is separate from material extraction. And so here you can see that GDP growth in the US goes up and material extraction is sort of flat. And in the United Kingdom, it's even more drastic. GDP grows up and then material extraction goes down. Oh my God, we have green growth. That is exactly what green growth should look like, right? Any ideas as to what's missing? Yes?
Imports?
Yep. The United Kingdom is an island that has exhausted all its own resources. So here you see that we have degrowth relative, degrowth absolute, and the problem is, of course, material consumption. So if you correct for trade, the material consumption of the UK and the United Kingdom is actually growing slightly faster than GDP starting from that baseline year. And globally, it's really hard to see very much difference. So basically, yes?
So material extraction, refer to the material that used inside the
Yeah, so you take the geographic boundary and you look at all the extraction.
Okay.
So it's the territorial accounting perspective. And using environmentally extended input-output, you can get the consumption-based perspective. Yeah. So, and that argument again came up again yesterday evening. Switzerland is doing great. Switzerland, in terms of emissions, it's not as, it has a small decrease in territorial emissions, but of course its consumption-based emissions are not doing that at all. Okay, and we have in the last couple of years, I'm just going to quote these because that way you have the references. You can have my slides afterwards, obviously, if you want. But Hickel and Callas in 2019, they did a review. There is no empirical evidence that absolute decoupling from resource use can be achieved on a global scale against a background of continued economic growth. Absolute decoupling from carbon emissions is highly unlikely to be achieved at a rate rapid enough. That's a really important point. Fast enough to prevent global warming. Even under optimistic conditions. Tim Jackson in Prosperity Without Growth, for green growth, you need to decarbonize at a rate 50 times faster than you've managed in the last decade. Green growth requires the invention of a miracle technology. Jackson and Victor in Science, proponents of so-called green growth must show that it is possible to effectively eliminate carbon emissions from developed economies in the space of little more than a decade with no impact at all on economic expansion. So basically, guys, the burden of proof is on your side and you don't have it. Two core facts that we really know. This is just like basic stuff that we know. We do not need to discuss it anymore. Economic growth is driving environmental breakdown, both in terms of climate, biodiversity, and other ones. So if you want evidence, there's scientists running on affluence, which is something that I helped with, and the biodiversity policy beyond economic growth of Otero et al. So Yago Otero and colleagues really demonstrated that economic growth is also driving biodiversity loss, which was often said not to be the case. That's just a fact. Just leave those as facts. It's empirically proven. Proposals that growth can be decoupled from environmental impacts have no basis in reality. That's another fact. And you have these reviews from the Hickel and Callas one I cited previously. There's two really immense articles published in 2020 in Environmental Research Letters, which are systematic reviews of the evidence on decoupling of GDP, resource use, and greenhouse gas emissions. So, 2 years ago we didn't have those, or a year and a half ago we didn't have those. We have them now, and they're part one is the how they did the review, and part two is synthesizing the insights. So they're really huge amounts of work by colleagues at the Institute of Social Ecology in Vienna, Dominik Wiedenhofer and Helmut Haberl. And I'll just give you two quotes from Wiedenhofer. A potentially fundamental incompatibility between economic growth and systemic societal changes to address the climate crisis is rarely considered. We conclude that the existing wealth of empirical evidence merits braver conceptual advances than we have seen thus far. And I would say that that's the job of us, of ecological economics, is these braver conceptual advances. In the Haberl et al. Paper, they say we conclude that large absolute reductions of resource use and greenhouse gas emissions cannot be achieved through observed decoupling rates. Hence, decoupling needs to be complemented by sufficiency-oriented strategies and strict enforcement of absolute reductions targets. And we'll be talking about maybe what these kinds of things might look like. More research is needed on interdependencies between well-being, resources, and emissions. And that's the kind of research that I do. So I think that's, of course, nice that you would say that. What a nice note. So basically, we're standing at a point in time when there's been a lot of progress in research. There's some things that among reasonable people we don't necessarily need to discuss very much anymore. And there's really exciting research that we can do on the basis of this understanding. So that's just sort of where I wanted to position the rest of the presentation. It's just like, okay, we now know this stuff at a sort of aggregate level, the role of growth, the role of resource use, not just emissions, not just end of pipe. And so what is the work that people are trying to do, and what is the work that still needs doing that's really exciting? So these are sort of more recent areas of ecological economics. I would say that one of them that we're going to be talking about quite a bit, I at a very late stage sent 3 article links, which I'm sure you've all had time to look at. Right, so we'll look at them together. It'll be fine. But some of it is about this idea of ecological macroeconomic modeling. And that's a really exciting new area, so that's something that I'd like to talk about with you. It's not my topic, but I think it's super interesting, and so hopefully we can discuss it. So the effort is to model the macroeconomic current and sustainable economies. So model finance and investment coherently with realistic monetary circulation, which is something that rarely happens in mainstream economic models. So we actually see cases where ecological economics is doing advances in just plain old economic modeling, because we need to have that better understanding in order to understand what a transformed economy would actually be doing. And this business of finance and monetary policy and understanding how you would represent that is really, really important. You also want to model specific sectors, and here I should probably have used the word industries, so, because later on in the papers they use sectors to mean institutions and industries to mean different sectors of productions. But basically you want to have your economy with high enough resolution. And most mainstream, to this day still a lot of mainstream economics are either one sector or 2 sector models. So they basically model the whole thing as just like one big market at equilibrium that is slowly changing in various ways, and you have aggregate things like GDP or employment or whatever coming out of it. But if you want to be doing the kind of modeling that we need to transform the economy, then you need to have different industries represented, because you're not going to be treating the fossil fuel industry the same way as you're going to be treating renewable energy. You're not going to be treating the care sector the same way that you're going to be treating Glencore, right? These are different things. You want to treat them in different ways. And you also want to be modeling the role of government and the role of central banks and financial institutions and banking separately. So you actually want to have these separate institutions, each with separate behavior and rules. Yes?
I proposing to model to all this model in model.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to be talking about.
Interesting.
No, and that's one of the things that a lot of the mainstream economic models are very synthetic. So they basically have like a couple of equations and a couple of parameters. And so the point is that how well are you representing reality? Are you representing it in the way that we can actually think about this transformation and the degree of resolution we want to? And the point of ecological economists is like, actually no. So we need to go and do this other stuff. Do you know, are you aware of, I didn't know this piece of economic history, so I'll just share it with you. Do you know who did the first quite famous two-sector economic model? Anyone? One of the few deserved Nobel Prizes in economics. There's not infinity. It was the first black man, so from Africa, to receive a Nobel Prize in economics. His name is Arthur Lewis. He was at the University of Manchester, and the reason I know about it is because I was in Manchester and I went into the Arthur Lewis building and I saw the thing about him. Yes?
Was it not in his curriculum?
Okay, I could have it wrong. It's possible, but I think he was
He
applying.
was a surplus labor person, right?
It was very much on labor, but I think he was applying, maybe I'm getting it wrong, because I think he applied his model to African countries and World Bank development, but he might also have been applying it to Caribbean ones. Yeah, no, that's fair enough. And his models were really super interesting because what he's trying to do with this two-sector model is he's trying to model the early stages of industrialization. And if you know about this, like anybody who knows about this, I'm not a specialist, obviously. So where you basically have an agrarian economy with agrarian labor, and then you have industrialization starting. And one of the things he showed with this two-sector model is that a rising tide does not lift all boats. That the better conditions of the industrial sector are at the expense of worsening conditions of the agrarian sector. And which, he really demonstrated this in terms of this not very innovative kind of model. And that's one of the reasons he got the Nobel Prize, and it's super interesting and cool to know that. Anyway, so but still to this day, this kind of resolution is not necessarily what's done. Yeah. So another sort of goal of ecological economics coming up is connection with heterodox economics and political economy concepts, including post-Keynesian ones, as well as more realistic understandings of money. So we'll get to this point. I would say that the connection with modern monetary theory is still a wish rather than a reality in terms of understanding how it would really work and how it fits with the modeling that's done. The work is still very much in progress, so efforts to conceive and model economics as a social science where the economy is a representation of social power relations, which is one of the goals of heterodox economics and political economy, including things like ownership, profit control, wealth, etc., is not obvious. And there's actually a bit of a tension between these two efforts, because in one of them, you're trying to basically make these very sort of quantitative, to some extent predictive, or at least exploratory models. In the other one, you're basically, which is considered respectable, right? Robust quantitative modeling is respectable. And if your other one, your goals are of representing power relations, and that's considered radical. So you have, and it's also more qualitative and more social science. So there's a bit of a tension, but I would say it's probably both are necessary, both are really interesting, and in general, if you're well behaved and not like making enemies all the time, tension is good for scientific advances. So I would say let's embrace it rather than fight. Say you need to do one or the other. Okay. So this was the first paper. Ooh, completely illegible. Especially from the back. We'll get to there. So on the modeling front, so there's this idea of ecological macroeconomic models. So I summarized it as, so I didn't have to keep typing it as EMEM, ecological macroeconomic models. And there was a very nice review that was published in the Journal of Ecological Economics in 2017 by Lucas Hart and Dan O'Neill of the University of Leeds, where I was before. This was actually the master's thesis of Lucas Hart, who is amazing. And so the article is a review of modeling development in ecological macroeconomics and an analysis of how the different models incorporate policy themes from the post-growth literature. So it basically has two goals, an overview and then understanding how the models overviewed interfaced with post-growth policies. And so one of the things that they first start out with is to explain that there are different goals of people who are doing ecological macroeconomic modeling. Not everybody has the unified purpose in life. And so there's already, I guess, pluralism or diversity there. So one is people who want to test post-growth theories or put them into play, at least in a model, basically thinking about managing without growth in an economy. So can you make a toy economy in your model that has some representation of reality that you believe to be basically true and see how things go. The second one is about the dependence of the economy on environmental resource use. So what is the shock or what is the effect going to be if you reduce environmental resource use on things like employment growth, trade, inflation, investment. And you can see why post-Keynesians would be interested in that as well. And then the other one is just integrating post-Keynesian and heterodox concepts into ecological economic modeling. The requirements reviewed, so what the models, they obviously had to decide what criteria, and I think these are interesting. So the ones they reviewed describe the total monetary economy in mathematical terms. So they have a formal way of dealing with the whole flow of money in the economy. That was one criteria. The second criteria was they should include different groups of agents or sectors, typically households, firms, and the government. So different institutions, different groups are represented. And the third is the aggregate economy should aggregate to a whole economy at the level of a nation state or a region. So it shouldn't be like, between two firms or something like that, something micro. It should really aggregate out to a macro thing. And they use the word sector to describe different groups of actors, such as firms, households, or government, while the word industry is used for different parts of the production system. So these are some of the post-growth policies that they were looking for. So they didn't require that each model should be interacting with these post-growth policies, but these are the sort of 8 categories they were looking for. One is integrating the environment. I guess that one's kind of obvious. Another one is economic inequality. That one is actually often quite tricky. In order to do that, you basically have to have a relationship between the way your economy behaves and an aggregate indicator of inequality, like a Gini coefficient, or you have to represent your population by different income groups. With each will have different revenues and employment and social benefits from government. It can get quite tricky. So not everybody does that. Everybody would love to do that, but not everybody does it because it can get quite complex. And do you believe it, right? There's a monetary system, so different levels of monetary and debt levels. There's disaggregated production and consumption. That one's quite important. So it involves disaggregated industries on the production side and ability to represent changes in consumer behavior to allow for the consumption of different products. That's really important. If we're talking about the green transformation of the economy, you have to model production changing and consumption changing. Otherwise, you're not really sure what's actually going on. Because this is where you tie into the physical reality of your environment, in specific industries and specific consumption patterns. There's work patterns. One of the post-growth proposals is work hour reduction. Like we can all supply our needs with much less time. So let's do that. Not work as much and live okay lives. So that's one of the proposals. But so that's something that people try to model because it's an interesting proposal. On the other hand, there's also workplace guarantees or job guarantees.